Summary report of the Wehrmacht High Command of June 11th and 12th, 1941. In the first months of the war year, 1941, the German Wehrmacht, under the leadership of its supreme commander, achieved new great victories in the fight against England on land, at sea, and in the air. They are worthy of joining the world historical successes of the year 1940. The Navy and Air Force continued to inflict severe blows on the British Wehrmacht, merchant shipping, and the war economy. In North Africa, the British advantages achieved over months through great superiority in numbers and weapons were quickly wiped out by a bold counterattack by German and Italian units. In the Balkans, Yugoslavia and Greece were defeated in a 3-week campaign, and the landed British troops were crushed, deprived of their heavy weapons and equipment, and expelled from the Greek mainland with a heavy loss of dead, wounded, and prisoners. The main task of the Navy, the disruption of the enemy's lifelines through the trade war, was carried out in the constant use of underwater and surface forces. Submarines attacked 19 convoys in the Atlantic region from the coast of Great Britain down to the west coast of Africa, dispersing them in tough pursuit, often lasting several days, and in some cases destroying all but a few ships. The British battleship Malaya, which was trying to secure a convoy in the mid-Atlantic, was badly damaged by torpedo hits. Battleships and cruisers carried out successful operations against heavily secured convoys in the same sea area. Speedboats sank enemy merchant ships in bold advances off the English East Coast and in the Channel, and auxiliary cruisers carried the trade war into the most distant overseas waters. In total, in the first 4 months of the year, 1941, 978,000 gross registered tons were sunk by submarines, 493,000 gross registered tons by surface forces. In total, 1,471,000 gross registered tons were sunk by the Navy. Added to this are the considerable losses that the enemy suffered from the use of mines in near and far waters, which cannot yet be determined in detail. Furthermore, a large number of valuable prizes from naval forces could be brought into German bases. 71 enemy aircraft were shot down by the Navy, 52 of them by naval artillery on land, and 19 by naval weapons on board. The outpost boats, which worked together with minesweepers to protect the domestic and German-occupied coasts, were particularly distinguished. Compared to these successes, the Navy's losses during this period were extremely low. They amounted to 1 torpedo boat, 3 submarines, and 3 smaller warcraft. The air war against the British Navy and merchant shipping was no less successful. In day and night attacks around Great Britain and in the Atlantic, 8 English warships were sunk, and another 24, including 2 cruisers and 8 destroyers, were damaged. In tireless efforts against convoys and armed merchant ships traveling alone, long-range attack aircraft, combat aircraft, and dive bombers sank 170 ships with almost 764,000 gross registered tons in the same sea area. Overall, from the beginning of the year to the end of April, England lost 2,235,000 gross registered tons of its own or usable merchant shipping space in this theater of war due to combat operations by the German Navy and Air Force, while over 1,200,000 gross registered tons of shipping space was damaged. The Luftwaffe also continued the fight against the British island with great ferocity. 38 retaliatory attacks, constantly increasing in scale, were directed against English transport centers, ports, and industrial areas. The capital, London, was the target of 30 air raids, including 12 major retaliatory attacks. The focus of the Luftwaffe's retaliatory attacks was on the British ports with their shipyards, which were important for the war effort. There is no doubt that their performance was severely impaired and that the construction and restoration of merchant and warships was largely disrupted. The key points of the British war economy were particularly hard hit. The British defense industry's performance is thus further reduced. A series of successful attacks on the forward airports of the British Air Force reduced its effectiveness. At this point, too, for the sake of historical truth, it must be stated again that it was England that began the night attacks on German cities and thus the mostly untargeted bombing of residential areas, despite all warnings. Nevertheless, the German Air Force tried as long as possible to avoid the retaliatory attack on the English civilian population, until it was finally forced by the increasingly unscrupulous bombing by British aircraft to take similar action itself. This was always expressly announced in the reports of the Wehrmacht High Command. However, while, apart from these retaliatory strikes, the German Air Force is still trying to avoid any unnecessary attacks on the English civilian population, the effect of the British air raids shows exactly the opposite picture. As a result, the military and defense economic damage caused was very low. At the same time, however, the percentage of explosive bombs that the British Air Force dropped on residential buildings in German cities, including hospitals, military hospitals, churches, and cemeteries, increased. This proved that Great Britain believes that it can wage an intentional war of terror against the German civilian population. This only confirms the justification of the German retaliatory strikes. German fighters and anti-aircraft units repelled the enemy's attacks on the Reich and the occupied areas with increasing success. Furthermore, the exemplary attitude of the civilian population and all air defense organizations reduced the risk of greater damage to property and blood being inflicted on the homeland. By the end of April, 97 enemy aircraft had been shot down by German anti-aircraft artillery. The number of English aircraft shot down in dogfights over Great Britain and the mainland is 271. Another 73 British aircraft were destroyed on the ground. As a result, the British Air Force lost 441 aircraft in this theater alone during the first 4 months of the year. In contrast, the losses of the German Luftwaffe were still significantly less than 50 from 100. The German sea and air warfare against England benefited particularly during the reporting period from the fact that Italy permanently tied down strong British sea and air forces in the Mediterranean. On the other hand, these increasingly threatened the Italian sea connections to Libya, and thus made it more difficult for the Italian army units stationed there to defend themselves against British forces that were far superior in numbers and technology and had been brought in from all parts of the empire. In order to ease the situation in the Mediterranean, a German flying corps under General of the Aviators Geisler was deployed in southern Italy at the beginning of January. In cooperation with Italian air units, it held down the British base on Malta in day and night attacks, inflicted heavy losses on the British naval forces, sank a considerable number of enemy ships, and fought with great success against the British airports in Egypt and Cyrenaica. A little later, the Führer and Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht decided, in accordance with an agreement with the Duce, to intervene directly with German troops on the side of the Italian Wehrmacht in North Africa. From mid-February onwards, these were transferred to Libya in continuous sea transports under the escort of Italian naval forces and with air protection by German and Italian pilots. Together with Italian rapid units already there, they formed the German Afrika Korps as part of the Italian army in Libya under the command of General Garibaldi, the leadership of which was entrusted to Lieutenant General Rommel, who had proven himself to be an excellent commander of a panzer division in the campaign against France. Immediately after disembarkation, German reconnaissance forces advanced to the west of El Agheila on February 22nd, thereby gaining a favorable starting position for further operations. The parts of the corps that gradually arrived and immediately moved forward caught up there without delay. The southern flank was secured against surprises by driving defenses deep into the desert. Even before the assembly of his forces was complete, General Rommel launched the attack on March 24th. As early as the 31st of March, armored troops of the Corps, effectively supported by combat units from the German and Italian Air Force, broke through the British positions east of El Agheila, which had been prepared for a long time and were staunchly defended. In the relentless pursuit of the enemy, who was now fleeing back to the north, Ajdabiya was taken on April 2nd, and just 2 days later, the port of Benghazi, which was important as a supply base for further operations. Rich loot fell into the hands of the Allies. Before the German and Italian divisions, which immediately advanced along the coast from the area around Benghazi, the enemy only retreated step by step to the east with multiple counterattacks. In the meantime, General Rommel had ordered strong motorized forces from his corps to advance across the desert in a northeasterly direction. On April 6th, after overcoming stubborn enemy resistance, they reached Bir Tengeder, 250 kilometers northeast of Ajdabiya. Parts turned here to the north, engaged a strong enemy group near El Machili on the same day and defeated them. In addition to heavy bloody losses, the enemy lost well over 2,000 prisoners, including several generals and countless military equipment. The remaining forces continued to advance to the northeast, and despite violent sandstorms and major supply difficulties, took the important coastal town of Derna on April 8th after a difficult battle. Major General Kirchheim particularly distinguished himself through his exemplary personal commitment. On April 9th, the parts of the Afrikakorps that had advanced along the coast also arrived there. After the fall of Derna, the pursuit of the escaped parts of the enemy was immediately begun. On April 10th, German and Italian troops reached the Tobruk area, where they were met by fresh and strong British forces. Here, running ahead of his troops, Lieutenant General von Prittwitz und Gaffron fell in the front line during a reconnaissance. On April 11th, the enclosure of the site, surrounded by commanding heights with fortress-like positions, was completed. Fast units also advanced on Bardia, which was taken on April 12th, and after several hours of fighting against British tanks, seized the border fort of Capuzzo and crossed the Egyptian border. Enemy counterattacks collapsed with heavy losses. Likewise, all attempts by the enemy, some with very strong forces and the use of tanks, to blow up the ever-tightening ring around Tobruk failed. In just under 2 months, the German Afrikakorps covered over 1,800 kilometers under the particularly difficult conditions of the African theater of war and in heavy fighting against strong British forces. Thanks to the bold, aggressive leadership and the outstanding performance of the German and Italian units, it was possible to recapture the entire Cyrenaica with the exception of Tobruk in a 3-week campaign, thereby undoing the previous British successes. The German and Italian air forces and the Italian Navy contributed greatly to the success of these operations. German Air Force units deployed in Libya under Major General Froelich and Italian air forces competing with them supported the army groups through long-range reconnaissance and effective intervention in ground combat. They hit enemy supplies hard with bold air attacks on columns, ships, and ports, and by mining the Suez Canal. By the end of April, 72 enemy aircraft were shot down with low own losses. The difficult task of sea transport from Italy to North Africa was accomplished quickly and successfully. Italian naval forces took over the escort. Thanks to their self-sacrificing efforts and the German and Italian air security that flew in all weathers, the losses during the transfer of the transport squadrons were kept to a minimum.
Thank you for listening. Join us also for Part 2 of the Wehrmacht Blitzkrieg briefing on the Mediterranean theater, focusing on the Balkans campaign. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. We'll get back to you next week. So long.